Two girls sat in the back of a patrol car, freshly arrested. And instead of panic, there was laughter.
Wait, they went through his phone? No, they're going to go through his phone.
Not fear, not shock, laughter. Then one of them said she did not feel guilty. And just like that, this case stopped sounding like a rumor. Because police say they were taken into custody about 20 minutes before the attack was supposed to happen. 20 minutes. Not enough time for second thoughts. Not enough time for the danger to fade. Just enough time to realize this had already moved far past talk. Investigators say a knife was already at school. A target had already been chosen. And inside what looked like an ordinary school day, the clock was already running. That is what makes the laughter so hard to forget. Because if police are right, those were not the words of two girls caught up in a bad joke. Those were the sounds of a plan that had gotten frighteningly close to real. And the most disturbing part was this. One of them did not sound scared that the plan existed. She sounded scared that someone had told. To understand why the court treated this so seriously, you have to look at what police say was already in place. Because by the time these girls were taken out of class, investigators say this was no longer just talk. It had a time, it had a setting, it had a target. Prosecutors said they were taken into custody about 20 minutes before the alleged attack was supposed to happen. And that number matters, because once a plan has a clock on it, it stops feeling abstract. It stops feeling distant. It starts feeling immediate. According to investigators, there was already a backpack, and inside it, police say, were items that made this case much harder to dismiss. A knife, gloves, trash bags, wipes, flowers. Not random objects, not harmless clutter. Objects the state says pointed to preparation. And the alleged setting made it even worse. Not somewhere off campus, not somewhere hidden far away. A school bathroom. An ordinary place inside an ordinary school day. The kind of place students pass without thinking. The kind of place that only becomes terrifying after you learn what police say was supposed to happen there. And then there was the digital side. Investigators say this case was not built on one reckless comment. There were private messages, talk of a blood ritual, a classmate whose movements had allegedly been tracked in advance. So before the courtroom ever reacted to the patrol car video, before the judge ever saw the footage that would later disturb her, the real question was already taking shape. How did something hidden inside a normal school day get this close to becoming real? But before any of that, one question matters most. Who heard this in time and decided not to stay quiet? What made this case so unsettling was how ordinary all of these people looked from the outside. Isabel Aurelia Valdez was 15. Luis Olivios Lippert was 14. Not adults, not authority figures, not people the public instinctively imagines at the center of an alleged murder plot inside a school. They were students, teenage girls, the kind of people most other students would have passed in a hallway without a second thought. And that matters. Because cases like this do not begin with the allegations. They begin with the shell those allegations sit inside. Youth, familiarity, normal routine, the visual language of everyday school life. No prior criminal record has been publicly reported for either girl. Nothing, at least in the public record, that prepared the outside world for allegations this extreme. And then came one of the strangest contrasts in the entire case. According to prosecutors, when police arrived, Valdez was writing a note to her parents. That image by itself sounds ordinary. A student at a desk, pen in hand, a page half filled. But investigators say the words on that page were anything but ordinary. They say the note described the planned killing as a fair and beautiful scene of devotion. That is the split at the center of this case. A teenage girl in a classroom, and language that prosecutors say belonged to something far darker than rebellion, anger, or adolescent fantasy. Then there is the boy police say was being targeted, He was not living inside the same story the girls were allegedly building. He was living inside an ordinary school day, going to class, moving through the halls, existing in public without knowing he had allegedly become the focus of private planning. Investigators say his schedule had been studied, his movements tracked, photos taken without his knowledge. That detail matters because it changes the victim's role in the story. He was not pulled into open conflict. He was, according to the allegations, being watched while he still believed he was safe. And the emotional center of that harm does not end with him. It widens through his mother, Jennifer, a speech-language pathologist at the same school. A mother who, according to reporting, described being unable to sleep or eat after learning about the alleged plan against her son, and then kept returning to work inside the same institution where that plan was allegedly taking shape. That is what gives the victim side of this case its weight. Not only the fear of what almost happened, but the proximity. The fact that the aftermath did not happen somewhere far away. It stayed in the hallways, in the classrooms, in the place where both her job and her son's routine were supposed to be ordinary. So before the case becomes all messages, evidence, and hearings, this is what has to be understood first. These were not strangers thrown together by some random event. These were minors moving through the same school, under the same roof, during the same ordinary day. And once investigators started laying out the timeline, the case stopped looking random. January 22, 2026. Somewhere inside an ordinary school day, one student made a decision that may have saved another. A student's life. Using the FortifyFL app, an anonymous tipster reported that Valdez had directly described a plan to kill somebody we know from school the next day. Not vague gossip, not secondhand rumor piled on top of rumor. According to the report, this was specific, a named intention, a time frame, a target inside the same school world they were all moving through. And that matters, because from that point on, this case stopped being about whether the words were disturbing. It became about how far those words had already traveled toward action. According to the evidence structure laid out by investigators, the alleged plan did not stay in one form. It moved. From ideation, to private digital discussion, to physical preparation, to what police say was the final approach to carrying it out. Investigators say Discord messages became one of the clearest windows into that progression. Messages that allegedly referenced the victim, a blood ritual, mass shooters, and a killing planned inside the school itself. Then the planning, according to police, became more concrete. The victim's schedule was allegedly memorized. His movements were allegedly tracked. Photos were allegedly taken without his knowledge. That is where the case begins to feel less like obsession at a distance and more like surveillance. Because once someone is no longer just being talked about, but studied, the emotional temperature changes. And then came the alleged setting. An upstairs bathroom at Lake Brantley High School. A real place, inside a real campus. Not symbolic, not hypothetical. A specific location prosecutors say had already been chosen. Police say a 12-inch knife had been sharpened in a school bathroom before the school day began. According to the state's theory, this was not an eruption in the moment. It was preparation waiting for its time. Investigators also say the plan carried a ritual logic of its own. Valdez allegedly intended to stab the victim, then consume blood as part of a belief system she later described to law enforcement. Flowers, police say, were meant to be part of the scene afterward. That detail is one of the reasons this case feels so psychologically disorienting. Because the allegations do not describe only violence. They describe violence arranged to mean something. And then the timeline tightens. By the time law enforcement moved in, prosecutors say they were about 20 minutes away from the alleged attack time. 20 minutes. Not enough time for a school day to look different from the outside. But, according to investigators, close enough that the alleged plan had already moved beyond messages and into position. That is why this case remains so tense even though no physical attack happened, because no one was stabbed. No forensic victim evidence exists. The bloodshed never came. And yet the entire weight of the case now hangs on a harder question. Had this remained fantasy talk between two teenagers? Or had it already crossed the line into execution, interrupted only before the final act? And up to this point, the story was already disturbing. Then came the items police say were sitting inside the backpack. Absolutely. That is when the case stopped depending on any one disturbing detail and started building pressure piece by piece, because on their own, some of these facts could be argued with, explained away, minimized. But together, they became much harder to dismiss. First came the question of preparation. Police say the backpack, recovered at the time of arrest, did not just contain one dangerous object. It contained a set of items that, taken together, suggested planning beyond a single violent moment. A knife, gloves, trash bags, wipes. Not just what prosecutors say could be used to attack someone, but what they say could be used to manage what came after. And that distinction matters, because it is one thing to allege violent intent. It is another to allege forethought about the aftermath. Then there was the detail that made the case feel even stranger. Flowers. A detail that does not fit cleanly into ordinary criminal logic. A detail that, according to the state's theory, made the alleged plan feel less impulsive and more ritualized. Then investigators had something else. Not an object this time. Words. According to reports, Valdez was pulled from class while writing a note to her parents, and prosecutors say that note described the planned killing as a fair and beautiful scene of devotion. That phrase matters because it does more than sound disturbing. It gives the alleged plan a meaning structure, not random anger, not chaotic violence, something she was allegedly trying to frame as purposeful, even beautiful. And once that idea appears, the digital evidence starts to matter differently. Because investigators say this was not just a case of reckless talk that spiraled out of control. They say there were private Discord messages that pointed in the same direction. References to a blood ritual. References connected to mass shooters. Conversations, the state says, showed the plan had an internal logic long before police stepped in. That is where the case begins to shift from threat to worldview. Then came the evidence of focus. According to police, the intended victim was not abstract. His schedule had allegedly been learned, his movements followed, pictures taken without his knowledge. That level of attention changes the shape of the allegation. Because once a target is being watched in real life, the distance between imagination and action gets smaller. Then came the contradiction investigators would not ignore. At first, Valdez reportedly denied knowing anything about the tip. Later, according to the affidavit, she gave detailed voluntary statements describing the plan. That movement, from denial to disclosure, matters for one reason above all. It gave investigators a way to compare what was first hidden with what was later admitted. And then the case became even more difficult to place neatly. Because according to the affidavit, Valdez also described hearing Adam Lanza's voice and believing a blood ritual could resurrect a dead mass shooter. That point has to be handled carefully. Those are reported statements in law enforcement records. They are not, at least in the public record, confirmed clinical findings. But even with that caution, they change the emotional temperature of the case, because now the alleged plan is not only violent, it is attached to a belief system that sounds obsessive, distorted, and deeply detached from ordinary reality. And then investigators had the one thing juries, judges, and viewers tend to remember longest: behavior after the arrest. Back in the patrol car, the girls laughed. Valdez said she did not feel guilty, and according to the record, she also made comments suggesting arrest had not been unthinkable to her. That detail may be one of the most revealing in the entire case, because if arrest was already part of the mental script, then prosecutors are not just describing a plan that risked being interrupted. They are describing a plan that had already made room for consequences. And that is what makes the evidence mountain so difficult to reduce to one category. No attack was carried out. No victim was physically wounded. No forensic crime scene had to be reconstructed after the fact. So the state case, at least from the public record, rises or falls on intent, on preparation, on behavior, on statements, on what was carried, what was written, what was said, and how close police believe all of it had come to becoming irreversible. That evidence was already disturbing on paper. Then the courtroom had to watch how one of the girls behaved after the arrest. What made the patrol car footage so powerful was not just what was said, it was how completely out of step it seemed with the moment. These were not two girls who looked overwhelmed by what had just happened. They did not sound like people crushed by consequences. They sounded comfortable. They laughed. Valdez worried about how she looked for a mugshot. And then came the line that would follow the case everywhere after that. She said she did not feel guilty. That is the false safety beat at the center of this story. Because in that moment, she seemed emotionally untouched by what police say had almost happened. Not shaken, not confused, not suddenly realizing the scale of the accusation. If anything, she sounded ahead of it, as if arrest itself had already been mentally accounted for. As if the real problem was not what had been planned, but that the plan had been interrupted. And then the setting changed. The same behavior that may have felt casual in the back of a patrol car was brought into a courtroom, placed on a screen, watched in silence. No longer private, no longer insulated by teenage bravado or the unreality of the first arrest. Now it had an audience, a judge, lawyers, a legal system deciding what this footage meant. Judge Melanie Chase watched that video from the bench, and then came the line that changed the emotional framing of the case. The video that I watched, she thought this was cute. That matters, because judges do not usually speak like that unless something has crossed a line for them. The footage did not make the defendant look immature, some softened, sympathetic way. It made the alleged danger feel colder, more deliberate, more difficult to dismiss as confusion or adolescent performance. And at that same hearing, prosecutors were not asking the court to react to the video in isolation. They were stacking it on top of everything else. The 20-minute window, the recovered supplies, the alleged planning, the claim that this was not a vague threat, but something already moving toward execution. So the patrol car video stopped being just one disturbing clip. It became part of the prosecution's larger argument that the threat had been real, immediate, and ongoing enough to justify detention and adult charges. And that is where the collapse happens in this case. Not as a dramatic outburst, not as tears on cue, not as the kind of courtroom breakdown viewers may expect from a more conventional sentencing scene. The collapse here is different, more structural, more public. It is the collapse of the innocence frame. A laughing teenage girl in the back of a patrol car can still, in isolation, be misread as shock, as immaturity, as someone not grasping reality. But once that same footage is replayed in court, once a judge watches it and openly signals disgust, the meaning changes. The words do not change, the behavior does not change, but the setting does. And once the institution answers back, the performance lands differently, harder, heavier, more dangerous. That is the real courtroom collapse in this case. The moment the distance between how the defendants appeared to see themselves and how the court saw them could no longer hold. And there is a second tension running underneath all of it. Lippert was 14. She laughed too. She was in that patrol car too. But public records, as laid out so far, place Valdez closer to the center of the alleged plan, as the older girl, the recruiter, the one tied more directly to the ideological language and operational direction. So even in this emotional centerpiece, The case does not flatten into one simple question of guilt. It opens a harder one. How much of this belonged equally to both girls? At what point does participation become authorship? And when the younger one is laughing too, what exactly are we watching? Shared intent? Influence? Loyalty? Bravado? Or some mixture the public record still does not fully explain? That is what makes this section hit so hard. It is not just the footage. It is what happens when that footage leaves the car, enters a courtroom, and stops looking like attitude, and starts looking like evidence. But even after all of that, the hardest question in this case still has not been answered. What lingers in this case is not just the alleged plan. It is where that plan was allegedly moving. A hallway, a bathroom, a desk, a backpack, a private message thread. Nothing about those things looks dramatic on its own. That is part of what makes this case so unsettling, because the most disturbing details were not hidden inside some obviously dangerous world. They were, according to the allegations, moving through ordinary spaces, the kind people trust without thinking, the kind children move through every day. And that is the deeper betrayal here. Not only the alleged targeting of one student by classmates who knew he was in danger before he did, not only the idea of violence inside a school, but the way normalcy itself appears to have been used as cover. A school is supposed to feel routine, predictable, structured. That is why parents send their children there. That is why students stop looking over their shoulders once they walk in. But according to prosecutors, this alleged plan was designed to move inside that routine unnoticed, inside shared hallways, inside a bathroom door no one would think twice about, inside a day that, from the outside, still looked completely ordinary. There is also the betrayal of peer trust. This was not, at least from the public record, an outside predator entering the school. It was classmates, students under the same roof, teenagers moving through the same environment as the person police say had become the target. And then there is the betrayal of expectation. Because when people imagine teenage defendants after an arrest this serious, they imagine fear, shock, tears, some visible sign that reality has finally broken through. But in this case, the image that stays with people is laughter. And that is part of why the footage has such weight. It violates the emotional script people expect to see. At the same time, this case may become harder to define as it moves forward. Not softer, not simpler, harder. Because if future evaluations were ever to support severe delusion or psychosis consistent with the statements attributed to Valdez, then the legal meaning of this case becomes more complicated. Not because the allegations become less disturbing, but because the law would then have to confront a harder question than simple condemnation. What exactly was this? Calculated evil, delusion, influence, immaturity, a fractured belief system, or some combination the legal process has not yet sorted out. And that uncertainty is one reason this case resists easy language. But while the legal system works through those questions, one image brings the case back down to earth. The victim's mother returning to work at the same school, same building, same campus, same ordinary setting where prosecutors say the alleged plan had been taking shape around her son. That image matters because it strips away internet shock and leaves behind something more lasting, aftershock. The kind that does not live in headlines, the kind that lives in routine, in returning to hallways that no longer feel harmless, in doing your job inside a place that now carries a different meaning forever. So here's the question this case leaves behind. Was this evil, delusion, influence, immaturity, or some combination the legal system still does not know how to name? Do you think that video showed a girl who felt nothing, or a girl who still had no idea what the consequences were about to become? Because in the end, that may be the hardest part of this case to answer. Was the most revealing thing the alleged plan itself? The fact that prosecutors say they were only 20 minutes away? Or the patrol car laughter after the arrest? the part that made the whole case feel colder than the evidence alone. And then there is the question underneath all of it. If Valdez was truly living inside some distorted or delusional belief system, does that change how this case should be understood? Or does it change nothing at all? And when it comes to Lippert, where do you place her? A full co-conspirator? A follower? A younger teenager pulled into something she did not fully create, but still went along with? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you follow courtroom collapses, interrogation, analysis, and real cases where one piece of evidence changes how everything is seen, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who follows true crime closely. Because in the next case, we are looking at another moment when false confidence met real evidence and did not survive it.